Hey everyone. Okay, so what was it on Monday? We had laptops that wouldn't run the presentation. On Tuesday, we had a bird join us in the room for part of the GatherTown session. And today, GatherTown itself is down. Uh, the forces of the centralized web and birds are conspiring against our plotting here. However, we are back. So thank you all for taking the time. Apologies for the slightly late start. Today, we're going to be talking about profit sharing communities. So this is a little bit, can someone from the ops team just tell me if they can see and see my screen, please? Okay, yep. You guys can see my screen. Optimal. Okay, so yes, profit sharing communities. We're going to be talking today about a fairer model for startups built on top of the decentralized web. You can think of this as kind of decentralized web native organizations. And one of the reasons for this is because the structures of the applications we can build, for all the reasons we've discussed so far in the Foundry, are quite different. This means that we can also sort of change the way that the startups themselves work, and the value accrual models and all the rest make more sense if we treat it in a different fashion. So the broad principle is that there are a better way of doing startups or building startups and structuring them, and they have deeper fundamental value, the assets associated with them, as well as fairer governance structures. And these are all represented on-chain in smart contracts inside, in our case, Arweave. So there's three key features of a profit-sharing community that make it different from a typical startup company. The first is real-time profit sharing. That is that every user interaction with an application, the application that the profit sharing community is building together, generates a small dividend. And what this means in practice is just when, for example, in some of you are building sort of decentralized social media applications like Twitter, when you would post a tweet, you would also take a small tip from the user, a very, very tiny amount, and you would distribute that to the owners of the profit sharing community through what we call a profit sharing token. And the tokens essentially just represent ownership in the startup or in the application that the startup is building, at least. Yes, and so you take a very small tip is one way of doing it. There's a few other different models, but that's broadly the principle. And this allows you to kind of piggyback on the natural process that on the decentralized web, users pay for their own usage. And so they pay the Arweave network this. It's kind of natural they also pay your application. And of course, these tips are so small that, and the same with the Arweave fees, that they're basically, what do you say, indetectable for the user. They don't care. They've got a wallet that's got like $10 in it or something, and that lasts for years and years and years. They don't care about these fees. But from your point of view, the aggregate of all of these fees can actually be quite significant. So this means that you essentially produce a yield, an APR, if you like, for owning a stake in an application. So if you own 10% of an application, right at the beginning, you might be able to buy it cheaply, and or maybe you're a founder, right? When people use the application over time and usage grows, this yield that you're getting grows too. And so now your assets have a strong fundamental value when you go to try and sell them to someone else. You can say, well, actually, this asset is producing, I don't know how much, $100,000, say, every year, this stake. So that's a pretty good asset to own. It's a kind of productive ownership in a startup rather than, and I think this only makes sense when we start to contrast it with the Web 2 model. Really in the Web 2 space, companies simply don't produce yield at all, actually. They just keep the profit they generate in their treasuries, and then they use those to try and invest in stuff. But if you're not necessarily sure that they're going to be able to build, that Uber can build the next Uber 2, then actually it makes much more sense if the profit from Uber is distributed to the people that own it, rather than accruing in the company itself. And so we think that these have a much stronger fundamental underlying value than typical share. And for other reasons we get to later around governance, this effect compounds. And of course, an interesting thing you can do, and I think an interesting thing for someone in the Foundry to build potentially, could be an auto-compounding profit-sharing token or profit-sharing community tool, I suppose. So if I own, I don't know, 5% of Arweave or something like that, and I want to keep buying bits of Arweave with the yield that I'm getting, then let's make a tool so that people can easily do that, so that it more, if people want to go that approach, it can more, would you say, naturally mimic a typical ownership of a share in at least a Web 2 startup. If people want that, but let's give them the opportunity to just say, okay, I think Arweave is a great application. I would just like to accrue some of the yield that it is making in profits to my account, please. And this system allows you to do that. I think that there's a potential with the way that the tech market is moving in general, and I'm a perma bear, I guess you could call it, in the trading space. Like I think that the tech space may possibly be in a bubble outside of the crypto sphere, like a wider one. But we'll see. But if that bubble bursts, I think that having strong fundamentals for the assets associated with your startup makes a lot of sense. It'll make them much more robust and less susceptible to shocks, let's say. 2, so using a profit sharing community, you can give much fairer ownership of the application to the people involved. What we mean by that really precisely is that every value producer can be easily rewarded. So typically in a Web 2 startup model, you would have the founders, they own like almost all the equity at the beginning. And then they would have investors come in and they sell like, maybe 30% in the first round, 30% after that, and they start to dilute over and over time. But as an employee, like an early stage employee, even at a typical Web 2 startup, you won't end up with actually that many, in terms of integer, if even a single integer, percentage ownership of the shares. And that's before things get diluted by the minting of further, I was going to call them tokens, but not tokens, but further equity to reward rounds, participants in later funding rounds. However, in a profit sharing community, you can keep a much easier control over the spread of tokens, and you can give tokens to every person that creates value, whether that be developers and operations people or whoever it has to be in the core organization to start with, but also to people that use the application at the beginning. This is just fundamentally different. So when people come along to your social media application, you can reward them in ownership of the application itself for taking the bet and taking the risk and investing their time into, using your application at a stage where potentially it might not be as good as the existing systems. And this is really important for stuff like social networks, where there are network effects, as they call them, to the applications. So more usage begets more usage, more or less. And in practice, that means that it's quite hard to break in with a social network. Like you won't go to decentralized Twitter tomorrow if no one's using it because everyone's on Twitter, right? But if you start giving people ownership of the application as a reward for doing useful activity on it, like posting stuff, so generating content, then people are more likely to stay. And you can, using this system, distribute rewards to those people as well. On top of that, you can also lock rewards in an easier and transparent way, so everyone can see like what is the token supply at any point in time, how will things progress, and there's beautiful UIs for that, like for example, Community XYZ, but you can also see some of that information on vBlock. There's super simple mechanisms for giving out essentially rewards to users in your profit sharing token or profit sharing community model. So one way of doing that is Astatine, which was built by the I think by the Verto team, or they call them, Theta is actually the name of their organization. And Verto, the profit sharing token exchange, is one of their products. But another one is Astatine, which is not a very easy to pronounce name. But what it allows you to do is basically with a very simple, just to start with, at least you can decentralize this later if you want, but to start with, you can use a GitHub action to once a day distribute tokens, your profit sharing tokens from your application to people that have taken part in using it relative to whatever rules you want. And this is a really powerful way of, just rewarding the early users and contributors to your system It's very, very simple to deploy. And they've done a lot of complex math to make it so that you can run basically programs that emit a reward over a period of time. So you can say, I want to distribute 1 million tokens to people for doing this particular activity, and the reward rate should halve once every year, something like that. And it should go on indefinitely. And then it'll work out what the curve has to look like. So on day 1, you should give this many tokens. And on day 1,000, you should give this many tokens, such that in a similar way to kind of Bitcoin, you have this exponentially decaying curve. So super helpful tool. Okay. The final big advantage to a profit sharing community is better governance. And what we mean by that is really centered around this equation. So the voting power in the organization that you're building cannot just be, what do you say, proportionate to the amount of ownership that the people or organizations, other organizations, own in your project. It can instead be proportional to the amount of ownership multiplied by the commitment time. And this gives, we haven't come up with a good phrase for this, but something like skin in the game weighted voting. So if you are a super passionate contributor and you love a project and you're willing to lock your tokens for like 4 years, you think in 4 years' time this is going to be an amazing project, then you will get more of a vote than someone that has 2 times as many tokens as you, but is only willing to lock those tokens for 3 months. Actually, you'll get, no, that math was a little bit wrong. I changed it during the example. But yes, you'll get some multiple, I think, in this case, 12 or 16 even times as much voting power if you are willing to stake those tokens for longer. And this means that, the people that are really passionate about the thing you're building get a bigger say in how it should be steered. And this is also important because it means that as everyone is accruing tips and dividends, essentially, in their while their tokens are locked, the longer they're locked for, the more incentivized they are to perform good governance, because they're essentially locked into the effects of their decisions personally. So they're incentivized to govern the organization in a good way, globally. And that can be really, really powerful. It fundamentally gets rid of the idea that short-term traders can influence decision-making in organizations. You have to really be committed to a project in order to have a serious sway in the voting procedure if you use this system. Okay, so that's a little bit about profit-sharing communities. And recently we've been thinking about a new idea that we're calling profit-sharing startups. It's a spin on the same concept, which, please don't let these words get, I don't know, would you say, muddled or jumbled up. I think we can probably come up with a better name than profit-sharing startups going forward, but this is kind of our working title for the model. It's a sister model, if you will, to profit-sharing communities. It's simply PSCs with, and this really depends on where you are in the world, but in most places, likely a reduced compliance overhead. So you can think of a profit-sharing startup as a vehicle you might want to use at the beginning, or if you're building a project or an application that you think just will stay quite small, then you can take this profit-sharing startup approach rather than a profit-sharing community approach, which you can think of as like a publicly listed company equivalent sort of level of regulatory burden and overhead and compliance issues. So a profit-sharing startup, the basic principle is one new rule. All tokens in this system are non-transferable. And this means that when you have some tokens minted and given to you, they are yours forever. You're never going to sell them to anyone. And they can be burnt or taken away from you by other members of the DAO. And we can mint more tokens together to reward more people, but they're never going to be given or sold. And this can change the sort of regulatory commitments and classifications, but really this depends on jurisdictions. This makes it much less like something that is a stock in a traditional company, which is the real question at hand. And also from a tax and compliance perspective, the asset can't be taxed because you can't do anything with it. You can't transfer it. You can't sell it to make a gain so that you can pay tax. Instead, in most places, and again, you'll have to speak to legal people and tax compliance people in your particular jurisdiction. But in most places, this will mean that just the income you get from the profit that is shared is taxed, and that's actually quite simple because it's just like a normal dividend distribution, basically. And so you can total up how much that is, and then you can sell some, and then you can pay your tax burden. This is, I would say, speculative, and it depends on which jurisdiction you're in, but this can change the model in some places to make it so that the overhead of getting started with this is much, much smaller and simpler. And then, of course, if you get to a sufficient point of decentralization later, you can basically clone your organization, make a new organization that's a normal profit sharing community, and with potentially the same capital ownership structure, and spin it off and go out there in the normal profit sharing community world and do all the typical things. But this is definitely a way, or what do you say, another tool in the toolbox for making it easy to get started without having to worry too much about this very, very complex and frankly, in a lot of places, uncertain legal compliance burden you have to deal with. All right, so thank you, everyone. That's a bit about profit sharing communities and profit sharing startups. Unfortunately, today we won't be going to GatherTown because, well, GatherTown is closed. But yes, I guess we'll meet again there on Friday for the community spotlight. And I'm super excited. I think we're going to have 3 or 4 different projects from the Foundry that are presenting what they're working on, the progress they've made, any help they need, and all sorts of other stuff. And then we'll have our typical coffee and mingle session afterwards. So I'm super excited to see you all there. Thanks, everyone.